Do Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of Just Another Tinfoil Hat, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Zelia Edgar. The aim of this show is to discuss all aspects of the paranormal, from the relatively mainstream to the downright bizarre, to pose questions and entertain ideas regarding every angle of the unexplained. So, hang on to your tinfoil hats, keep your hands and feet inside the saucer, and please, enjoy the ride. Tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce my guest. Paul Weston is the author of Mysterium Artorias, Aleister Crowley and the Aeon of Horus, Avalonian Aeon, The Glastonbury Zodiac and Earth Mysteries Ufology, Glastonbury Psychogeography, The Michael Line, the Kabbalah, and the Tarot, Etergatus, William Blake and the Glastonbury Gnosis, and the Occult Battle of Britain. He also published and contributed to the anthology Signs and Secrets of the Glastonbury Zodiac. Having majored in comparative religion for a combined arts degree, Paul went on to work for the Scientology-influenced Institute of Hypnosis and Parapsychology. He eventually became completely absorbed into the Glastonbury Matrix, and was fortunate to be closely involved in the psychic questing work of Andrew Collins. A frequent lecturer whose presentations are increasingly uploaded onto YouTube, his other main influences and inspirations include Colin Wilson, Dion Fortune, Reiki, Mother Mira, the Fellowship of Isis, Adi Da, John Coper Powers, Osho, Psychogeography, Gurdjieff, Anthony Robbins, and Ufology. All right, so without further ado, I would like to welcome my guest, Paul Weston. Paul, thank you very much for appearing on the show.
My pleasure, Zelia.
So, I have to say, you sent me a few documents, and even in those few pages of material, there's just such amazing. You've been in contact with such amazing cases throughout your career. And how long have you been involved with the paranormal?
Well, I've been interested in all these subjects since I was a child. Growing up in the 60s, watching programs like The Invaders and Star Trek and so on, you're primed for this kind of thing, and Doctor Who and so forth in its golden period. But from the mid-70s onwards, I started to input, quality literature and pay attention. And especially by the time I got into the 80s, it's the Jacques Valleys and the John Keels and so on. And then when I met Andrew Collins in 1988, I started to become aware of an enormous corpus of quite extraordinary material that fitted in very well with what I was already interested in.
Yeah, that's really cool. Do you notice, this is something that I've just picked up on a few times in my interviews. Do you notice that a lot of the times people who are interested in the paranormal have had a really lifelong interest in it? They can't really trace where it starts, or they have had some sort of event that really made them start turning their interest towards the unexplained?
Well, when I first met Andy, one of the things that interested me about the studies that he'd done when he was a UFO researcher along with Graham Phillips was when they were talking to people that had had variety of different experiences of, close encounters 1 through 3, 4, that they would ask them about their childhoods, and they would find that quite often such people have got a history of altered states, strange experiences, and that there are certain things, for example, memories of being very young in the childhood bedroom and lights, small lights kind of playing about, maybe a few strange ghostly-like companions, not standard issue ghosts, but this kind of thing, and being prone to vivid dreams, perhaps, just quite passionate interests in different periods of history, and a broad spectrum of being prone to synchronicities and so forth. That there was something there in this, that there is, if you like, a kind of type that people that have the extreme experiences, they don't come out of a vacuum. They're not as normal as they might sometimes want to make out they are. That in fact, in some sense, it's always been waiting for something to just, be the prime that sets them off.
See, it's kind of hilarious because, I've had many personal experiences with the paranormal, the unexplained, however you want to call it, throughout my life. And the bizarre thing is that it wasn't until I was literally asked on a podcast, does that have anything to do with your interest, that I realized I had never, ever tied my interest in the paranormal with personal experiences with it. And I know it was also reading one of Jenny Randall's books where she mentions the, like you just mentioned, really early encounters with lights or orbs, things like that, which, of course, that was one of my very first paranormal encounters was I saw an orb that was out in the hallway. And it was one of those things where I read that and I just kind of was like, maybe there was some sort of subconscious connection there that it literally took, 2 decades to figure out.
I think this is the mystery of what I might call the awakening process. And I think it's very strongly depicted in Whitley Strieber's Communion, because he starts to get these little glimpses of some other strange thing that's going on in his life. And as he begins to uncover them, what he realises is that these things that he's starting to get glimpses of are by no means insignificant. They are, in fact, the most important things in his life. And that there is another side of his life which is, in fact, more ultimately real and more important than his everyday life. And it is that life that has in some way been living him. And, all the way through these things that you've been experiencing are, in fact, a glimpse of your more real, more true life that is always been there. And now it's like, the only game there is, for me, is once you've intuited that something like that is going on, is how to dissolve the barriers between your everyday limited self in 3D time and whatever this enormous multidimensional mystery is that is somehow the real matrix of this, some inner myth that you are somehow trying to come to and live out, and you get, once you catch up on yourself, it accelerates.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, because I know too, what are the conditions really that you've noticed for people who have, contact or high, just proximity to paranormal events? And do you see often that, a lot of researchers will note that if someone has, a certain type of paranormal event, say they have a lot of ghost activity, they're also more prone to see UFOs or they're more prone to see cryptids. And I know that's something that you've definitely picked up on as well.
There's no question that there's a continuity there. And this is that big mystery of what do we call pre-selection and what do we call destiny? Is there something that is laid down outside of normal time space from more or less the moment you're born that dictates that there are going to be a series of episodes and awakenings, and there will come a point where you gather enough of it to make some kind of step forward with it. Now, there does seem to be, it's a known thing that a certain amount of psychism does run in people's families, that usually if people experience pretty extreme things, that there is going to be, if it's not a parent, a grandparent, or there's going to be something somewhere, there's going to be something in the family line that maybe predisposes them towards that. But that's not 100%. There's always going to be mysterious exceptions to that broad principle, and that's one of the things that is just, it seems as if, I'm getting a mood of Jacques Vallée here, that there is just something that is kind of experimenting with our consciousness and always just a little step ahead of our rationality, and just seeks to draw us ever more deeply into the mystery, because as we do that, in order to accommodate our increased understanding of what's happening to us, we've got to investigate these wider and wider fields. As Keel realised, it's just the whole spectrum of the paranormal, from ghosts and poltergeists and vampires and demons and whatever, right across into ufology and entities and communications. It is, very, very fruitful to try and take it all in as a unity. But in order to do that, you've got to absolutely devour an enormous amount of info, and you've also got to cultivate quite an unusual attitude, one that's not part of our consensus even now. Even now it's, over 50 years since Mothman, and yet to be able to accommodate the high strangeness that story represents, even though shows like Hellier are getting it to a wider and wider audience. It's not a normal mindset, and it's inviting us to function on a different level of the game. And it is some kind of initiatory process, both for individuals and potentially for larger groups of people as well, because clearly, the way the world is, the way the world's been for the last 100 years, if we just carry on in the same state of mind with the same sense of what, reality is, then some pretty big problems are going to get even worse. We've been invited to shift gears inside our heads.
Yeah, we were chatting a little bit before starting recording too. And I know, it's one of those things where even more than disclosure, because of course it's my personal belief on things that large and by most world governments probably don't know as much more about the UFO phenomenon than, your average investigator, just because I believe it's a much larger issue than simply extraterrestrials visiting Earth. More than even disclosure, my big hope is that people in the paranormal will start really looking at this big picture and looking at it in a more unified way. What are your thoughts on that? I know you were saying that it's you think it's getting to be a little bit more mainstream, but probably the end is not in sight, unfortunately.
I think it's great that people are starting to find out more about the worldview of John Keel through the likes of Hellier, because that to me is the way forward. I think ufology for a long, long time has always been dominated by the nuts and bolts contingent and just the kind of, the Hollywood movies and so forth. There's a very fixed way of thinking what this subject really consists of. And as we know, the extreme advocates of that view are quite often very uncomfortable with high strangeness and the idea that there is a human brain factor in this, that when people come into the proximity of whatever this mysterious something is, all kinds of funny things start happening, which do seem very dreamlike, very distorted, that may end up leaving screen memories behind. The idea that our consciousness and psychology is profoundly involved in this ought to be, to me, it's always been profoundly exciting and inspirational. And I just hope that we've now got a cumulative effect over a period of decades with enough people that have been interested in this kind of thing, enough people that have had their weird experiences of psychedelic drugs and have input an enormous amount of literature, the whole discourse becomes far more widely disseminated in the era of the internet, in the era of the YouTube and podcasts and so forth. Simply more people are going to hear about this stuff on any given occasion than they would have done when I was your age, back in the early 80s, when there's no internet and the amount of books that you can find, it's quite a slog to find stuff, whereas you can just Google about on Google now and suddenly find something you've never heard of, a minute later, and be reading it shortly after that and be having your head fried with something that it might have taken months for you to come to decades ago.
Yeah, that's a very good point. No, it's nice to hear too, because I know a lot of the time if you sort of propound the idea, well, maybe this phenomenon is reflective or it somehow responds to the human subconscious or the collective subconscious, I feel like a lot of the kind of more diehard believers, they get very disheartened by that. And of course, that's something that I think too is just, it's a very exciting concept, because it's not to say that these strange things don't exist. It's the exact opposite. It's that they do exist and they are somehow tied to us, which I think by now there's so many cases where that, it's very hard to ignore that fact.
And it's been there from the very, very earliest days of ufology, when, somebody like Meade Lane, who is kind of like an occultist and is kind of like a medium, is talking about the ether ships and beings from other dimensions that are changing their rate of vibration in order to come through and manifest in this world. This sort of stuff is already circulating very, very early, in the late 40s, in the age of ufology, and people that were mediums, spiritualistic mediums start, contacting the Space Brothers, and that whole 50s era is obviously extremely strange and owing to all sorts of controversy and contention. But the fact that there is a consciousness aspect to all of this. That people are having these inner experiences as well as the supposed outer experiences. To me, stood out a mile from the moment that I first became aware of it.
Oh, yeah. Well, contact, too. I mean, that is, I feel like when you're dealing with ufology, and this is something that just didn't even hit me because, of course, growing up in the late 90s, early 2000s, I just completely, cattle mutilations, space aliens, they were all tied to the UFO phenomenon. And it's reading these, earlier works, specifically Jacques Vallée with the cattle mutilations and Ivan Sanderson with the occupants of UFOs. I did not realize that there was such a struggle even to tie these things to the UFO phenomenon. It was almost like for the longest time people, will talk about the saucer, but not, I think there's even a Keel article actually that was called Never Mind the Saucer, Did You See Who Was Driving It? And that completely bewildered me when I first realized that.
Well, yeah, the whole contact thing is to me almost the first port of call in the investigation of all this, because it's another one of those things that really does show you, the full spectrum and the broad idea, in ufology. I think in Trojan Horse, Keel is saying that an unknown extra-dimensional intelligence controls important events by manipulating specific human beings through the phenomenon of mystical illumination. Now, we've got the idea that, people get zapped by a beam of light from some kind of craft in the sky. And, there was a movie in the 90s, the John Travolta Phenomenon, that kind of dramatises that. But this kind of thing works across the spectrum. We've got the classic case in the Bible of St. Paul getting blasted by light on the road to Damascus. And of course, people are going to be trying to interpret that forever in terms of is he an epileptic? Is it some kind of brain phenomenon? But one way or another, and Aleister Crowley talks about this in his book Magic, that it's one of the most interesting things when a comparatively normal person gets their consciousness completely mutated and comes out the other side of it, some kind of genius. Their IQs skyrockets and their old lives, are left behind and they become in some sense outstanding. And this is there, all the way through mysticism, and it's there very much, in ufology, that these people get, at the very least, an emotional high out of this thing, that however much their critical intelligence might be, mashed, the amount of emotional energy that they can bring into what they're doing, they can create a whole weird cult around themselves or convince people that the world's going to end. And whatever this intelligence is, it does seem to play games with people, as Keel realised during the Mothman time. They'll keep you going along with what appears to be accurate information. If you go out on a hill at a certain time at a certain night, you're going to see a light in the sky, so people do, and there it is. And then they gradually just build it up and build it up. And when the world is supposed to end, it doesn't. Or when it comes to the crucial details about there's going to be a huge, great nationwide power failure at the time that the White House Christmas tree is switched on, that doesn't happen. But the Point Pleasant Bridge disaster does. And Keel gets upset about all this. Robert Anton Wilson in Cosmic Trigger puts the interesting idea that these whatever they are, these intelligences outside of normal space-time, they're not quite fully plugged into our space-time, and they'll get things wrong. They'll tell Keel that the Pope's going to be stabbed or something on a visit to Turkey, I think it was, and it doesn't happen until 3 years later, and it's not quite the same as how they said it. But it's quite obvious that this is somehow an accurate thing floating about in the ethers. But you end up with this at the very heart of the phenomenon. It doesn't ever want you to actually nail it down, to actually be clear about it, to be concrete about it. And this is where I think, the quest for disclosure has been thwarted. I don't know how long now I've seen this going around in circles. I was mentioning to you before we started recording that I remember when the Close Encounters movie came out, in the mid-70s, people were talking about, oh, this is just, Spielberg's working with the government and there's going to be disclosure and blah, blah, blah. And pretty much every time a year comes around that's got a 7 in it and it's the anniversary of Roswell and Kenneth Arnold, we get the same sort of talk going on. And I don't understand how people have got the emotional stamina to just keep, after decades, to not realise that however near it seems to be getting and however it's always some spectacular stuff, but it never, ever quite delivers. So I don't even expect it to. I'm just not plugged into that at all. I'm just into the mystery and the interactive nature of it, and the fact that there are people who basically will say, you can do this stuff to order. You can make stuff happen. The occultists, they get their contacts and then they have their weird ceremonies and they do their stuff with the combinations of smells and different visuals and words and trance states and concentration and dreamlike conditions, and they bring it on. They will have an experience where some discarnate thing is supposedly talking to them, or they'll see something appear in front of them. The ufologists, other than people like Alan Greenfield, I think he's way ahead of the game there, in as much as he's actually created kind of out of one of Aleister Crowley's ceremonies, he's created his own version of that using all the ufological entities from the 50s and 60s and woven it in there. It's an invitation to basically not be passive. The idea that one is passive in this is not the case. Clearly, John Keel was not passive, and this is something that I think is very important. That when he went into this thing, people often suggested to him that this whole thing got way more complex and weird once he entered the vicinity in West Virginia, and he played it down. But I'm not in any doubt about the fact that he was some kind of semi-shamanic figure, and that his background, which was quite a long and extensive one, he'd not led a normal life at all at the point where he entered the scene in the mid-60s there, was a factor in ramping it all up. And the incredible high strangeness and Men in Black stuff that played out that we know from Mothman prophecies, I don't think it would have happened if he hadn't been manoeuvred into place. And he was manoeuvred into place. He was pre-selected. I'm not in any doubt about that. I can't offer any definitive theory, but it just seems blindingly obvious that was the case.
Well, that definitely hit me, actually, when I first read the Mothman prophecies, and especially, the further along you get into any of Keel's work, is he did seem so involved, not only in the lives of the people, especially in Point Pleasant, or, the lives of anyone that he was in contact with, but in the events themselves. When he discusses how, I was listening to a talk of his where he said that there was this one field near Point Pleasant where these purple lights would actually kind of come off of the river and swirl around him. And that to me was just, because I was affiliated with MUFON for a short time. And what really hit me in trying to handle cases is that, trying to figure out where a UFO was going to be was trying to figure out where lightning was going to strike, pretty much. That's kind of the vibe you get from people who really kind of look at ufology simply as ufology. And I feel like it's similar, too, with, a lot of cryptids. You can kind of be like, okay, so there have been sightings here for so long. But, when you get these outlier cryptids like the Enfield Horror, the Dover Demon, there's almost, you can't figure out a pattern with that. And that, to me, is just at complete odds with the way that Keel really handled his investigation. And Jacques Vallée, in some of his later works, too, I know at the end of Messengers of Deception, he discusses how synchronicity kind of started creeping into his life. Do you see that happen a lot with investigators, that when they really start involving themselves?
Without a doubt, this is why I really encourage people to not think that investigation into these realms is a passive subject, that you are kind of looking for something out there that is separate from you. If you look at John Keel's early life autobiography, Jardo, although there are people that would maybe say he's perhaps spinning the yarns a little bit tall, the fact that he spent his 25th birthday with the Yazidis, the fact that he's had these adventures out on the slopes of the Himalayas looking for Yeti, the fact that he's done, radio broadcasts from inside the Great Pyramid, that he's seen his first UFO in Egypt and so forth. This doesn't exactly set you up to be Mr. Normal. Yeah. This before he even gets there. And he obviously has, a very well-primed mind that he's able to realise, what he later expresses in Trojan Horse and in Mothman Prophecies, that you're on a complete spectrum here, and it's as if, I would venture to suggest that the phenomenon it requires human agencies of a certain type in order to express its nuances. And with Keel and Valley, there was something that wanted to kind of be laid out as clues for everybody that's able to follow them as to what this whole thing can be. In this country, what I've written about in one of my books, Glastonbury Zodiac and Earth Mysteries Ufology, because we've got our ancient sites, we've got our stone circles, we've got Stonehenge and Avebury, and I'm here in Glastonbury. There was a whole thing about whether or not UFOs were somehow navigating using ley lines, using ancient sites. And what happened as a result of this is kind of ideas that were going around in the early 60s in this country. People would go out on sky watches at these ancient sites, and as if, almost as a sideline, they started to become interested in those sites. They started to become interested in the folklore. Every ancient site is going to have folklore of, your phantom dogs and your ghosts and a whole bunch of stuff going back hundreds or even thousands of years. And people would then find that they were getting into the study of this as a thing in itself. And it was like the ufological lights in the sky mystery was, Shat Valley might have said it was a carrier wave. It activated people's brains to something else, almost, without them realising. And then it kind of moved on. It's not like we don't get any of these kind of things, but the sense that they navigate by light, not many people have those ideas anymore. But yeah, you still get lights, you still get all kinds of weird stuff. The likes of Andrew Collins investigate this. But it was like a whole field of study relating to the past has been activated through ufology. And I'm sure you find over in the States that Native American law, the whole stuff relating to all of these phenomena, your cryptids and your Bigfoots and so on, stuff that's been around for a really long time, has somehow been activated through its connection with ufology, and that the ufology has kind of somehow switched this stuff on, and it's serving some bigger, more mysterious purpose.
Oh yeah, you definitely see that, especially with I'm from the Midwest, Wisconsin to be exact. We have the effigy mounds, and yeah, there's a lot of different paranormal activity that people tie to the mounds. So it is, and Keel even discussed that a little bit, I think, in Mothman Prophecies, but I might be wrong about that one. But no, that's a good question. That's something that, of course, I'm sure everyone has heard of Ancient Aliens, the TV show on History Channel. And the thing that I've always kind of wondered, because the thing that they propound a lot in that is that at some point in the past, most cultures accepted the existence, and of course, they're very much extraterrestrial hypothesis in these extraterrestrials in UFOs. And that is still something that, I have to wonder, because a lot of ancient sites appear to be tied to paranormal activity, specifically UFOs. Do you think at some point in the past, were cultures more, I don't want to say open to accepting that, or were they just, do you think that it is some sort of like these ancient sites kind of just measure, maybe different energies, and that's why they were built there? Because I know that was the struggle that Keel had.
The mistake is to bring in the nuts and bolts hypothesis as such a kind of, item of faith. I think that basically people are far more sensitive to the natural world and the mysteries and so on. They lived far more intimately with nature. The shamans, the visionaries of these societies would be open to things that appeared to come from the stars, that appeared to come from between the worlds. And, that's how that kind of mythology gets built up. There's all kinds of, Andrew Collins in the Cygnus Mystery has shown how, various cosmic rays from the Cygnus system were able to reach down beneath the ground into caves back in, very, very ancient prehistoric times. And there seems to have been, a kind of shamanic culture, cave art and so forth, where the mysteries of the religious mysteries of these societies were focused. And who knows what's happening to their brains? Who knows what effects some of this stuff is literally having on them. And it's to me, it's I don't really talk about extraterrestrials. I talk about interdimensionals. I find that far more fruitful. And I think that unquestionably at the core of, most of the archaic societies, and still there in their lore, and still manifesting quite often at the sites of their ancient gathering, are these kind of things. They're very much there, and whatever they're all about, I want us to become aware of them again for whatever reason that is. Now, back in the early 50s, because of the nukes and so forth, it's like, that we've got to mend our ways or the world will die. There's all kinds of concerns about ecology now. Maybe that's the case. Maybe it isn't. All I'm certain of is that at this epoch in time, we're recapitulating. We are being asked to go back into the psychohistory of our collective unconscious, of our ancestors. And in doing that, we realise that their inspirations, the roots of our culture and so forth, our art, our science maybe, have come from people that were not in a normal state of consciousness. Whether they were probably chomping on some mushrooms, they were probably doing some weird stuff, but they were opening themselves up to influences that are outside of the normal realms of perception. So they are, in one sense, the definition of it, extraterrestrial, but not in the obvious way that ancient aliens tend to lay it on.
And I would like to remind everyone that you are listening to Just Another Tinfoil Hat, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Zelia Edgar, and we are visiting with Paul Weston. That's an interesting thing, too, because I know, again, to bring up Keel, I believe it was the end of the Eighth Tower where he was discussing how, with our current electronic age, it's almost like we're jamming the frequencies, and he kind of wondered what the implications of that would be. And of course, that the Eighth Tower was, I believe, released in the late 60s or early 70s, I can't remember which. And I can only imagine what he would think of the world today with the way that, we have just electronic noise everywhere. Do you think that that might have something to do with this kind of revamped interest in the ways of looking at this in a kind of more unified way?
Well, whatever this, whatever these EM frequencies and 5G and so forth are doing to our heads, it's making the weirdness all the more intensified. And, the way in which our knowledge of ancient cultures is being ramped up by very intriguing, archaeological discoveries. For example, for Andy Collins' work with Göbekli Tepe in the Denisovan Cave, this stuff, it's like some intelligence wants us to remember, that there is something enormous culturally, spiritually, psychologically that has been forgotten and lost. How that all hangs together with the way our brains are maybe getting scrambled, they haven't been scrambled sufficiently to block those signals. In fact, the signals are getting stronger. So that's very, very intriguing, and I sort of resist having any definitive opinions on what is ultimately good and bad about this. It does seem that a lot of this electronic pollution is not good for us. But as I say, it's not stopping these profoundly important signals from registering. So whether it's actually opening up bits of our heads to hear these signals more, I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, well, something, too, that I've noticed, the strange thing, it always goes back to, with skeptics, so everyone has a camera now on their phone or whatever, why are we not getting pictures? And the thing that I've always wondered, because of course, and this has to do mainly with cryptids, I feel like one of the best pieces of evidence for a cryptid ever is probably the Patterson-Gimlin footage, which of course was not captured on digital but analog film. And I've always kind of wondered if there is, it seems like in my opinion, from what I have seen and read about the phenomenon, it really seems like there is kind of an allowance of either it wants to be seen or it doesn't. And I think that also extends to what's taken down of it, and pictures are, I think, it definitely plays into that. What do you think about the whole digital camera thing? Because to me, it just seems like a lot of the times people say it's almost like they forget their camera was there, it malfunctions, it was charged, all of a sudden it wasn't. Do you think that this stuff can actually affect a digital or cellular camera?
I don't doubt that it can do, and I don't also doubt that in order for a person to experience it, they've maybe got to be in a state of mind where they've literally just forgotten for the moment about how to, that they might even want to take a picture, or if they do, that their own body chemistry, their own body electricity has somehow been changed by whatever it is that's going on, that, and therefore prevents, at the moment. Now, I'm not saying that there's not going to come a point where our science isn't going to advance enough to get over that. We've come so far, even in the last 50 years, in terms of what we can record of things and infrared and how we can become aware of the changes of our own body chemistry by monitoring ourselves and so on. I think this is an important fact, but in this country, people that have gone looking for the likes of the Loch Ness Monster, they can get the best sighting ever, but they're not going to get any film footage of it, and they're not going to get any decent photographs of it, or not so far anyway. It's very, very rare, and if anybody ever does, no one's going to believe it anyway.
Yeah, that's the truth, is now everything it is, well, of course that could be faked.
Yeah.
But no, I do. I think that there is, there's got to be some sort of give and take, not only with our own consciousness and the phenomena, but also what it does allow to be seen or to be known. What do you think? Something that, as I learn more about the contact phenomenon, what comes forward is that, so many different contactees come forward with equally intriguing, equally detailed descriptions, almost religions of involving their contacts. What do you think of these messages, especially, when they're so detailed, but they also have such variance?
Well, we had so much of it in the 50s. The 50s were already there as a golden age of this kind of crazy old stuff right from the word go. And that's why it's sometimes a bit frustrating that people don't seem to steep themselves in the law and the history, and they just endlessly repeat the same old stuff. The contactee cultists who create their weird universes where they're all about to ascend and be beamed up to the mothership, or the world's going to end or whatever. The fact that they do not seem to have any kind of perspective on the fact that this kind of thing has just happened over and over and over again, it is a little bit upsetting. These worlds are unquestionably dreamlike, and I sometimes use the terminology waking dream to help me get a handle on certain things, from a Jungian point of view. When really deep, powerful processes are in motion, the unconscious externalizes itself, and hence you get synchronicities and so forth. Now, when these dreamlike experiences occur, I think it's a case of like something very deep, not just in the mind of the experiencer, but in some sense outside them, has come to the surface. And it is not on a normal level of perception, and people mistake it, when they see some kind of great drama being played out in a visionary way. And, who knows what the hell was going on in the 50s when people thought they were being taken on board various craft and taken out to this, various planets and different galaxies, and met up with people in plausible 1950s movie outfits and had all this played out. It's obvious that their own consciousness is part of it. It's obvious that the cultural mythology and the fabric of the time is a potent factor in it. But it's like, what is really going on here? And yeah, there is that kind of message of you need to reform the human race because, you're taking a wrong turn, etc. But when it comes to the religious thing, again, it's like this is an invitation to study more widely. Just as with the high strangeness that you get with Keel, you're invited to study the whole of the paranormal. End of the world cults, Book of Revelation type stuff, the end times, the fact that, the rapture, the evangelical rapture is a kind of science fiction cult in its own way. There is like a spectrum here, and it's like the emotional archetype that is kind of activated tells you a little bit about where all this is coming from, and that it's not separate from some of these, more obviously religious things. Science fiction UFO cultism is a form of religion. It's obvious with like the rail group and so on. Some of this is very obvious, but people still, don't get the intensity of emotion that they project onto the Space Brothers and salvation from above is essentially a religious thing. I'm sure you come across somewhere along the line, there are some nuts and bolts enthusiasts who the level and intensity of their belief in the reality of it is almost shocking. It has a religious fervour about it, even though they would consider themselves to be entirely materialist, and they're putting forward an absolutely tangible physical explanation for things. And that's where it gets a little bit, you need maximum discernment, and it's like if stuff starts happening to you yourself, this is where, the trained occultist angle comes in. Somebody like Aleister Crowley would have some weird thing happen to him. You have a way of testing it out. You have ways of establishing whether you think, this is for real, and that you have to follow it. No matter how emotionally compelling it is, you still don't have to believe it. You can still have a meta perspective on it and understand that it's some kind of immense emotional activation, and that maybe there are other ways in which it can take you forward. But again, it's like there's a bit of a big study course that you kind of need to put yourself through in order to stand a chance of it. So that's maybe a bit intimidating. Not everyone is going to be, chewing up books and just devouring the entire cultural and mythological history of multiple things. But, some of us are. Some of us are.
See, it's an interesting thing, too, because I know, I have a current project going on involving UFO occupant clothing, just because I kind of noticed that, much like the craft, you never really have the same UFO occupant or UFO seen twice. I mean, that's kind of generalization, but, you see these trends that all these things go through. And the thing that I'm very interested in is, going at it from this angle that, I believe Vallée kind of compared the phenomenon to a projector. He said we watch the projection, we don't watch the actual mechanism behind the projection. And I think that's got a lot to do with this phenomenon, that we are seeing some sort of manifestation or projection as opposed to the mechanism behind it, what's actually causing it. Do you think is there any portion of the actual mechanism that does kind of leak through this facade, so to speak? Because I know that's the thing that I'm really intrigued by is, are there cases where we are seeing the actual phenomenon itself as opposed to what the phenomenon is presenting?
I don't think you can kind of take the human brain and the perceptual apparatus out of the picture. You're never, going to be able to see it through a completely undistorted filter. And getting back to the British side of things in the 60s, there's a guy called John Michel who wrote a book called The Flying Saucer Vision in 1967, and he has his own variant of that point, which you can only really get an understanding of this thing by looking at the effects. You're never going to really be able to figure out the cause. And in this country, as I said, part of the effects were this kind of carrier wave that the ancient mysteries, the sacred sites, the ley lines, your Glastonburys and your stone circles somehow get powered up, and when people start thinking that maybe the dragons in the ancient myths and the stories of King Arthur might be UFOs. So it's like those dragons get powered up and you then forget about the UFOs. So it's something that's working through the human brain. It's also working outside the human brain as well, clearly, because there are some sort of physical, tangible effects going on out there. Andy Collins has done a lot of work with into plasma and so forth, that there's an interface between, our consciousness and the outside. And I know that you're going to be covering at some point Trevor James Constable's work. Mm-hmm. The idea there are, weird life forms in our upper atmosphere that are kind of conduits between stuff from outside and our own human life, and that you can interact with them. All this kind of thing, that's about as near to the edge as I think you can get with it.
Yeah, well, and I think that, too, a lot of people, they get very tripped up by things either have to be totally physical, it has to be, nuts and bolts spacecraft and flesh and blood creatures, or it's completely immaterial, and it's some sort of, people take the term ultra-terrestrial, which of course was Keel used it a lot and was coined by Sanderson. They take that very literally. But the more you really look at the evidence, it seems like there is kind of, it's at this weird halfway point.
And that's the way it's going to be, at any given point, it might change a little bit, but that's kind of like where the action is. Back in the 90s, this carrier wave in this country kind of shifted from classic ufology over into crop circle land. Now, although, I'm inclined to feel that most of these formations are actually made by people, Andy Collins has collected an awful lot of information on the extremely strange experiences that these people have that lead them to do this, and even while they're doing it. And he indeed carried out in 1993 and 4 experiments along the lines of James Constable using a cloud buster and trying to take photographs of what I call the blobby dudes in the sky with amoebal things, with infrared cameras and so on. And he got some very interesting results out of this. Out in the States, out in the Mojave Desert and so on, you've just got spectacular environments. I think people should just be carrying on having a go at this. I don't think there should ever be a lapse in this. There should always be at least a few people that are just carrying on doing this, because I think that, there are all kinds of results and interfaces, and people will link up, what they discover about one angle of it with another. But you just, and it's part of what you're doing, your idealistic enterprise, is to make people aware of this rich history of really far out and remarkable, interesting stuff. And the fact that you can, go out and do your own thing with it. It's not just a case of going out on some hill in the middle of the night, just staring out into space, hoping you see a spacecraft. There are so many cases. What the Hellier people are doing is one thing, but what Trevor James Constable did is another. And obviously with Keel as well, prepare yourself. Put yourself through a whole bunch of disciplines and an enormous amount of reading and understanding, and train yourself up as a shaman or a martial artist or some kind of mixture of all these things. And then when you walk into the river, some kind of mystery, you've got a pretty strong chance that it's going to kick off around you. Being willing to believe that and knowing that is the case, because there's so many studies and examples of it, is an important part of the preparation, I think. That all of these studies, paranormal and ufology, they're not passive. Every group of investigators now, the Hellier team investigate with people, going into attempts to pick up psychic information and so on. Back in the 50s, as I said, in the classic days of the contactees, there's all kinds of mediums and so on. You've got a lot of people in the 80s channeling various entities. The New Age side of channeling the Space Brothers does get extremely embarrassing, but it's not to say that if you don't, cultivate a bit of critical intelligence, that you may get some things going on that are actually useful to you. You don't have to go overboard, and become, a complete space case, literally.
Yeah. Well, I feel like, the interesting thing is a lot of this stuff, like the channeling, it reminds me a lot of, ghost EVPs or people who are trying to communicate with ghosts. It seems like a lot of the time it's the mode of communication is nearly identical, and I feel like I'm hoping that we are, more people are going to be a little bit more comfortable with at least expressing that these similarities exist.
Yeah, well, back in the 50s when George Adamski and Desmond Leslie got their big book together and put that out there, I think there's a letter between them. It might have been Leslie to Adamski that, like, all of a sudden, all the spirit mediums that used to have, Native Americans as their spirit guides, or would have sort of dead First World War soldiers and stuff like that. Now they're just talking to the Space Brothers. What the hell's happened? And it's clear from this that there is this spectrum, and that it's there to be made use of, rather than to just losing yourself in a hall of mirrors.
Yeah. Well, one of the cases that you sent me information on, of course, was the Sunderland case. And I know it was amazing when I clicked open the document and read that. I was like, I'm just reading a book by Jenny Randalls that deals with that. And
so what book is that you're reading?
It's, oh gosh, I feel like I'm going to mispronounce this. It's the Pennine UFO Mystery, I believe it is.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. And, reading that too, it's just, I love how she writes because, at every point she's like, you can check my reasoning on this, but I hold it to be sound. And, she never really outright says throughout, at least, the points I'm at, what she thinks it is. And I really, I think that's a really good way to go about it, because she's just offering what's happened very clearly and concisely. And no, that case is one that just absolutely intrigues me because, every now and again you have these just really kind of blockbuster cases where it starts with maybe one aspect of the paranormal and then it kind of hits almost every other aspect. And this is one of those where, initially it's the UFO angle of lights in the sky, and then all of a sudden you have the poltergeist activity, the Men in Black. Would you want to go talk a little bit about that? I know we don't have much time left, but
yeah, I'm going to briefly lead in with the other case that is also from the same period of time and that drew Andrew Collins and Graham Phillips and the Sunderland family together and led into an immense, broadly paranormal saga. And this is the Day family. This is the first ever recorded British abduction case. This is in October 1974. And there's a family, the parents, 3 children. They've been out at night. They're travelling home by car along a country road, and they see a weird blue light in the sky, and it kind of drops out of sight. And then they come around the corner, and there's a bank of green mist. And they drive through it, and they don't think anything's particularly amiss. But when they get home, because the father was wanted to get home in time to watch a particular TV programme, they realise they've lost 3 hours. And this is, disconcerting, but it takes a gradual whole unfolding over a period of a couple of years where their whole lives have sort of changed. The parents have given up smoking and drinking, become vegetarian. They start getting plagued by weird dreams and poltergeist phenomenon. They seem to develop ESP abilities, and they start getting interested in the ancient mysteries of the landscape, the stone circles and so on. So it's in 1977 that they contact Andrew Collins, who was then, a teenage UFO researcher, and he brings in a hypnotist, and the father of the family recalls being taken, out of the car onto some weird craft and medically examined. Now, this is all, this is 1977. This kind of stuff is now very well known, but this was literally the first ever recorded British case, and there was not very, very much knowledge at all of the few American ones. Now, Andy's, they've met up with, Andy Collins is working with Graham Phillips, who's also a name that people who watch the History Channel will be familiar with. They've got this investigation group together they call Parasearch, and one of Graham's friends, Martin Keatburn, has introduced them to a woman called Marion Sunderland, and it's her family that have had this extraordinary case that has started in 1976, when her daughter Gaynor, who's 9 at the time, is riding her bike through a country lane. They're living out in Wales, when she sees something glinting in a field, and it's a silver-shaped object. And she says it's about 30 feet across, and it's got a row of what seem to be windows, and it's just sitting there. And she thought it's like a tent or something. And then this classic silver-suited humanoid entity, seemingly male, appears. It's got a helmet on, but you can see this kind of face behind him, big round eyes, tiny little dots of pupils, a thin line for a mouth, and, the knees seem further up the legs than normal. It's kind of a little bit like more of the dreamlike aspects of the 50s stuff. And she sees all this. She's there for a while. She sees this thing for supposedly about 15 minutes and just looks at it, and then she makes a sound, and this alien notices her. And the whole craft, it's like they're doing this normal thing from 50s ufology. There's a female, they seem to be kind of wandering about, making little holes in the ground and taking samples. And then after about half an hour, they go back inside, and weird noises are emitted from this craft, and it picks up and goes off, and away it's gone. And it did leave a trace behind it, supposedly a flattened circle in the grass. And her brother, who was 8, also during the same period of time saw a whole weird scene with a landed craft. I won't go into all the details, but again, it's absolutely preposterous from a normal point of view. But this is like, part of a spectrum. And once they bring in investigators, and Jenny Randalls gets involved as well, there's a whole kind of paranormal spectrum of stuff that plays out around them. And Gaynor has indeed had, an odd early childhood, lights playing around in the bedroom, lights that would come through the windows. And the more they investigate, the more intensified it becomes. There's ghostly figures appearing around the place. It seems like there's a kind of Men in Black thing going on around them. And then, there's a whole episode where she's taken through some kind of tunnel in her bedroom and meets these entities and goes onto a craft and so on. But considering that she's 9, they actually tell her that it's something that's going on in her subconscious mind, which rather than that they've physically taken her out of her body to another planet. But this all helps set in motion a really strange atmosphere in the place. And Graham Phillips, this is now in October 1979, he goes into a strange altered state of consciousness and starts talking in a voice that isn't his normal voice and starts talking about the Pharaoh Akhenaten. And from that point, a whole enormous great saga kicks off, which is the beginning of what we call psychic questing in this country, where you end up going out into the landscape and using every single means possible, visionary states, psychic information, historical research, synchronicities, to investigate mysteries. And they get into this whole episode, this history that plays out from the Pharaoh Akhenaten that involves this country, that goes through all the usual suspects like the Knights Templars and the Rosicrucians and the Victorians right up to the present day. And that's a whole story told in Graham's book, The Green Stone, and Andy's book, The Seventh Sword, and also in My Avalonian Eon. I won't go any more into that story. It's enough to basically show that at the roots of what becomes a great paranormal occult drama is ufology, profound ufology. And in fact, Andy, I think, investigated the first 5 abduction cases in this country in the mid-70s. And it's surprising, how much weirdness surrounded all of them, really. The family that were abducted in 74, that one of the things they'd said was that a group of people are going to be brought together in the Midlands of this country for some big destiny paranormal drama. And that is indeed what played out. So how all this works, it seemed to be a very strong indication that for everyone involved, they should always be aware that there was a complete spectrum there. And, this was October 74. Over in the States, you got that golden period around about 73, 74, where Philip K. Dick's having his farless experience, and Robert Anton Wilson is having his serious experience, and Timothy Leary's in prison, coming up with the Starseed transmissions, and John C. Lilly's getting plugged into some Borg-like intelligence that's going to take over the whole world, and Uri Geller's having his weird one with Spectra and so forth. It's a big picture in terms of how it's played out. Everything that Andrew Collins has done since, and Graham for that matter, they can trace back to those days. There's a continuity, and this story keeps on coming back round. There are aspects of it that endlessly return. And indeed, Whitley Strieber was aware of this whole story, and he made a point of wanting to meet Gaynor Sunderland when he was over here in the late 70s, because he not the late 70s, in the 80s, because he recognised that there was points of contact with his own experiences.
Wow. Yeah, I know that the era of the late 60s through, I feel like, the mid 70s, it just seems like there was just so much activity. I don't know, too, I think that a lot of that might have to do, at least perception-wise, with, the investigators who were dealing with it. There were just so many of these big-name, very intriguing investigators. But I do feel like there is just something about that time frame where you do, especially, on the States side, you have all of these really strange, bizarre outlier cryptids, these cases of attendant high strangeness. Do you think there is something to that era?
I think it's definitely the case that now we are being invited to really take stock of that again. That there's stuff that has been, there or thereabouts in the books that has been known to a fair few of us for decades. that all of a sudden there is a freshness and a power and a vitality about all of these cases that seems to be wanting to, get us all infused again. I think, there was a book by a guy called Eric Davis about the various cases like John Lilly and Philip K. Dick and Robert Anton Wilson and Leary from that period. Absolutely encyclopedic. That it seems that it's important for us to get to really look at this stuff again. That there are lessons to be learned from it, and that what settled that off in the first place, right across the world, because it was a very mysterious period of time, it is somehow in the airwaves again now. We can't say it's going to play out in exactly the same way, but something that if we're fully forewarned and we've got all the right information and ideas in our consciousness, we will notice, we will say, that's that again, isn't it? This is this. When that happens, such and such happened. If we go along with this, then maybe it will, and maybe we shouldn't, because look what happens to so and so. We've got the benefit of all of the experience and knowledge of these remarkable, sometimes flawed people, and it's our kind of responsibility to make use of it, to communicate it, to make sure that in this time where we have this medium that can reach so many people, that we effectively do make sure that people have the option. They know that, maybe there's something worth having a look at here, whatever it is they happen to be up to in their various locales, as they engage with their local folklore, their local mysteries, their local ghosties. I mean, everywhere now, has got an ancient site not that far away. Even if it's in a city, there's some remnant of it. There's where it was. There's some kind of ghost story. Everywhere in America is conscious now of whatever Native American tribe had occupied that bit of land, what their beliefs were, what their folklore was. You've trawled through the archives, you've got all the ghost stories and your phantom airships and just every last thing that goes back however far, and you realise it goes back into infinity. So you're ready, you're primed to fully engage, as never before. And, you won't get definitive answers, you won't get disclosure, but I think there's going to be some pretty astonishing stuff is set to play out. And that's, got to be good.
Yeah, that is a really, really exciting concept to me. That, these ideas, they're kind of like, attention should be brought to them. So I couldn't agree more. But I suppose as we're nearly at time, do you have any events coming up that you'd like to let people know about or direct people to any websites or books? All my books are available on Kindle, Amazon. I've covered ufology at some considerable length in my Aleister Crowley in the Inn of Horus. From an experiencer point of view, not personal, but more broadly in my book, Atageis, and the English side of things in my book, Glastonbury Zodiac and Earth Mysteries Ufology, which I did get a few moments on Ancient Aliens talking about last year. So there's plenty of ufological material there. And, there's a lot of my I've got a YouTube channel. There's quite a few videos that I've done there. And I'm easy enough to find on Facebook and so on, and on my website, paulwestonglastonbury.com. Awesome. Well, this was really just a fascinating conversation. Thank you again so much for being on the show.
And thank you, Celia, and a happy birthday for tomorrow.
Nice. Thank you so much. Once again, I would like to thank my guest, Paul Weston, for an absolutely intriguing conversation tonight. I would also like to thank Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson, the people in charge here at the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and a thank you, too, to John Hutchinson for composing my intro and outro music. With all that said, if you enjoyed this program, you can catch new episodes every other Monday on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and go ahead and check out my YouTube channel, also called Just Another Tinfoil Hat. Again, this has been Just Another Tinfoil Hat, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and I am Zelia Edgar, signing off.